listen, Donald Trump's not done. Did anybody hear what he had to say just yesterday? And I'll tell you, it was outrageous. So he said on the issue of freedom of choice, reproductive freedom, he said that he will do what he wants because, quote, this is his perspective, he will do it whether the women like it or not. Whether the women like it or not. Can you imagine? We have an opportunity in this election to turn the page on a decade of Donald Trump trying to keep us divided and afraid of each other. We're done with that.
Later tonight, Vice President Harris holds another rally in Nevada, this one in Las Vegas, where she will be joined by Jennifer Lopez. Joining us now, John Ralston, CEO of the Nevada Independent, and Maya Rupert, a Democratic political strategist who served in senior roles on the Elizabeth Warren and the Julian Castro presidential campaigns. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us tonight. Maya, let's just lean into this again. Donald Trump's weird thing that he keeps on talking about how he's going to protect women. Now he says whether they want it or not. If I were Donald Trump, I would not sort of talk about doing things to or for women, whether they wanted to or not. But it's, regardless of his phrasing and his framing of it, it's just not true.
Right. That's exactly right. And I think that when we have moments like this, when we see Donald Trump sort of taking some of these positions where it doesn't make sense, he's sort of speaking nonsense. Very clearly what is happening is he is being told that he has a problem with women. He needs to try to appeal to women, but he doesn't have anything to say. His policies are disastrous for women. He has an incredibly backwards view of gender. Project 2025 is absolutely catastrophic for issues that impact women. And so what he's going to do is make these off-the-wall claims that they don't mean anything. And the reason they don't mean anything is that he doesn't have anything real to say.
John, let's talk about Nevada. Nevada could become truly one of the most important states in this election, particularly if, for some reason, Kamala Harris struggles in the blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. If she loses any one of those, Nevada becomes quite central to the decision-making here. Tell me about the early vote. There's a discussion about the fact that statewide GOP early votes exceed Democratic votes. But how is someone like me supposed to think about that? Does it mean something other than the fact that you've got a presidential campaign who's not actually campaigning against early voting?
Yeah, well, they've changed, Ellie. You're absolutely right. You remember back in 2020, Trump was telling Republicans, don't mail in your votes, don't early vote.
Yep.
But changed. They suddenly woke up and realized what a terrible strategy that was. So they front loaded their vote. So for the first time in about 5 presidential cycles, Ellie, you have the Republicans banking votes instead of the Democrats. And there are some Democrats who are concerned about that. But Nevada's voting has changed. You know, Ellie, the Democrats have won the presidential race here 4 cycles in a row. It's been 20 years since the Republicans have won, but things have changed a lot. We're now a state where mail ballots are very important, and there's still a lot of mail ballots out there, and Democrats dominate in mail ballots. So I wouldn't say that Nevada is definitely going in to the Republican column, but the Democrats have to hope that a lot more mail ballots. And one other thing, if I might, Allie, there's a lot more independent voters now in Nevada. The demographics have changed. They're the plurality. The Democrats think the majority are going for them. They're going to end up being about 28, 29% of the vote, maybe even 30% of the vote. So it's far from over in Nevada, but the Republicans definitely have an advantage right now.
Maya, Chris Hayes was just having a conversation with Bernie Sanders. There are a number of people who are trying to address this issue of disaffected Democratic voters, voters who are sort of dissatisfied, might be sitting on their hands, might be part of the uncommitted movement, might be frustrated about the Harris-Biden position on Israel-Gaza. And a number of them are making the argument that, as Bernie Sanders has, who said, I don't agree with Biden or Harris on this issue, but I agree with them more than I agree with Trump. Things can get worse under Trump, and we will not have certain fights to fight if you decide to sit this one out. What's the best argument for either progressives or people who are still considering sitting this election out?
I think there are 2 very strong arguments. One, I think, on the issues that people are concerned about and expressing concern about. I think what people need to remember is that you never know. When you elect a president, you never know what that person is going to be faced with. You have to deal with how you've seen them sort of confront issues, what their temperament is, and how they listen to people. I think we have already seen with Kamala Harris that she has listened to the progressive movement, the uncommitted voters, the people who are saying, I don't like our policy in Gaza. I think that impulse, that instinct to listen, that instinct to say, I can learn something new and change my mind, that's what we have to vote on, right? We never know what the situation the person faces actually will be. But if we vote for someone whose temperament we trust, that's what we're getting. And there's a stark difference with the way that Kamala Harris has approached issues where people disagree with her and the way Donald Trump approaches issues where people disagree with him. And I think it's a very, very clear choice.
John, let me ask you about Elon Musk. From his posts on X, you would get the impression that he's fully running the ground game in several states, the get out the vote game in several states, including in Nevada. Of course, Nevada is noted for that historic Harry Reid ground get out the vote operation. Talk to me about what's actually happening on the ground in Nevada, because again, the impression you get if you're following Elon Musk's posts are that they have mastered the ground game in Nevada, and that is going to change everything.
Well, Elon Musk may know how to build a great electric vehicle, and he may know eventually, Ali, how to get to Mars, but he knows nothing about getting out the vote. And as you mentioned, the Harry Reid machine is formidable. It's why the Democrats have won every presidential race here since 2008. But the demographics have changed, and Elon Musk, if he has nothing else, he has a lot of money, and he has hired some good operatives, including a guy who used to work for the Trump campaign, a guy by the name of Chris Carr, who helped the governor the Republican governor win a close race here in 2022. But you can't direct this stuff overnight, Ali. It takes a long time to build a get out the vote infrastructure, to register voters and then make sure they get them to the polls. The Democrats have some inherent advantages always over the Republicans, not just the Reid machine, but having unions who are part of that machine and nonprofits who are out there in the various minority communities recruiting people to register and then get out the vote. So if it were a fair fight, I'd take the Reid machine over Elon Musk, and of course Charlie Kirk was also part of this. But the problem is for the Democrats is the demographics have changed, Ali, since Barack Obama won the state by fairly large margins, and then Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden only won by 2.5 points, and now the registration is very close. So they're concerned, and no matter what Elon Musk is doing or not doing, this is probably going to be a close race.
Maya, depending on who you're talking to, reproductive rights might be the biggest thing this issue, immigration might be the biggest thing this issue, but across the board, the economy continues to be the biggest issue, almost always is in every election. Even the Wall Street Journal today has said that the next president will inherit a remarkable economy. A number of Nobel Prize-winning economists have come out and talked about Harris's economy. And frankly, as a guy who studies this on a regular basis, it's a strong economy. Is there something about that message that's not fully resonating? Because if people are economy voters, your choice is a little bit clearer, unless you are a billionaire, in fact, in which case you should vote for Donald Trump.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, I think there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect. People say that they are voting on the economy. They want answers on the economy. We have a strong economy right now under the Biden-Harris administration. And Harris has put out plans for how she will continue to help poor and working families pay for things. Donald Trump has put out plans that have been blasted by economists, regardless of political affiliation, because they are going to be just catastrophic for working families. And so, again, there does seem to be, people are saying they want to vote on an issue where it seems like there would only be one clear choice. But again, I mean, I think that this is one of those situations where people, people are being asked about something, they're not necessarily going to go to a website. They're not necessarily going to sort of listen, like, read a plan. What they need is for people to make it plain. And that's what these next few days are about, which is why it's so interesting that Donald Trump seems to have given up the ghost on talking to new voters, bringing people over, while Harris is out there making her affirmative case. He seems to have been taking the tack that he's only going to speak to the base. And I think that we're going to see those differences really play out over these next few days.
One of the things you're seeing very clearly in Nevada, John, is what the effect of the anti-immigrant sentiment that the Trump campaign has been talking about. Some of it's specifically anti-Latino and Hispanic, but some of it's not. Some of it's anti-Haitian, whatever it happens to be. Is that manifesting? Are you hearing or seeing how that's manifesting among particularly immigrant voters or voters who are descendant of immigrants?
Well, as you know, Ellie, even though we're not a border state, immigration has been an issue going back many, many cycles here because Nevada has a very high undocumented worker population and a very big Hispanic population. It can be as much as 20% of the electorate. And it's been well documented over the last few cycles that they have become more skeptical of the Democratic Party. And I don't want to suggest that the Latino vote is monolithic, but parts of the Latino vote have become skeptical. And in Nevada, remember, a lot of these are service workers in the culinary union. They were disproportionately crushed here in the economy by COVID. And even though we have recovered, Allie, there's still some people who are suffering. A lot of them are Latino. And while some of the polling shows that they are drifting away, at least enough to maybe put Trump over the top here, there is a sense among the Democrats that Hispanics here generally make up their minds later than other voters and that they can still be coaxed into the Democratic camp. That's what happened in 2022 when the first Latina ever elected to the U.S. Senate, Catherine Cortez Masto, was seen lagging with Latinos, but exit polls eventually showed her getting to 60%. Harris needs to get to 60%, Ellie.